Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. This is a really unique moment. We get to say that our listeners are going to get what we've described as a nearly perfect episode of the podcast Missing. It has every element that you want. It's historical, it has intrigue, it has jilted lovers, and it has an expert who's come on out of the blue. Emailed us out of the blue to say, hey, do you want to talk about this? Because I have a lot of knowledge about it. So this is a really, really cool episode. Very excited to get the feedback on this. But Tim, I need feedback from you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, our guest today is a librarian from Worcester, Massachusetts, where Crawlspace Media had a studio for years. And so I guess I take it he must have found us that way. And so he emailed us about the disappearance of Eda Riel. And this librarian fellow's name is Ross Griffiths, and he has done a lot of research on the case, and he's dug up some old newspaper articles. And when I say old, I'm talking about 90 years old. Eda Riel disappeared from Worcester, Massachusetts on November 22nd, 1934. So yeah, you mentioned this is kind of an episode that has a lot of the markers that we discuss on this show. This one really doesn't have so much of an emotional tie because we don't talk to her family or anything like that. And the case is old enough where it feels a little bit removed, but there are real world consequences. And you'll understand that if you get near the end of the episode, because Eda had a baby and who grew up. It's a really crazy story.
And there are elements here where you wonder, like, could this have happened nowadays? There are certain moments in Eda's disappearance that you think, okay, if this was in the 2020s, she probably wouldn't have done this, or somebody would have seen her here, or they could trace her through a cell phone. But there are also other moments where there's no explanation. Even if it happened today, phone calls at the train station, things like that. Like, it's so rich with story, it almost feels like fiction. And then you add on to the fact that you can look up the old True Detective magazine coverage of this, like the old magazine called True Detective covered this in depth. That adds that other element of that other layer of, I feel like this is fiction. I feel like this is something that David Fincher could sign up on and make a crazy cool movie. But it's true. And you're right. It has these current world ramifications.
Yeah, and it's an older mystery, and it is truly a mystery that's stood the test of time. Really hope we do get answers, but yeah, we're 90 years into this one, so quite a mysterious disappearance. All right, everyone, please follow us on social media at Missing CSM. We're also on YouTube at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening. We really appreciate it.
And we're going to take a quick break for a commercial. And after that, we are going to take you back to the 1930s with Ross Griffiths and Eda Riel.
Welcome to the podcast. Ross Griffiths, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out to us. I feel like I say this a lot, but I always have to reiterate this. We love it when people contact us out of the blue, for the most part, and say, I have something. And I have this passion. I have this story. It's a mystery. I've been looking into it for a long time. And not only did you bring that to us, but you gave us one of our favorite things, which is a extremely cold case. This is something that is historical and it's also local. We love Worcester. But before we get into all that, can you introduce yourself to our audience? What do you do and why are you here?
My name is Ross Griffiths. I am a resident of Worcester, Massachusetts, here today, where we're talking from. I am the archives librarian at Worcester State University, and that means I really do two separate jobs. One of those jobs is general library stuff, so developing collections, working with researchers, doing some library instruction. But the other job is working with the archives and special collections at the university. So these are materials that are old or rare or unusual that need a little extra care and are usually kept in a separate space. And so that's really my background, and that was one of the ways that I first discovered this story.
Yeah, very cool. And also very cool that you're a librarian. I don't think have we had a librarian on the show, Tim?
I don't think so.
You're a first.
I'm proud to be the first.
How do you get into that? When did you decide that that was going to be your profession?
I had kind of a roundabout career path. I was one of those people that was a history major in college. What do you do as a history major? I got a job at a history museum with a bachelor's degree in history. And after a couple of years there, you kind of hit a glass ceiling. And I said, well, do I continue in museums or do I go more toward archives and libraries? I have a really great aunt who is a librarian. I've known some cool librarians in my time. I love working with historical documents and photographs. And so I decided to go to library school and get a master's degree in library science with a concentration in archives and records management. And after getting my first job, I got a second master's degree in history. And a lot of librarians kind of find their way into the field after trying out different things. And I'm one of those people.
Very cool. And how did you discover the disappearance, the story of the disappearance of Eda Riel?
I was doing general research in the history of Worcester State. So when I started, part of what I had to do was really familiarize myself with the university's history and get a feel for it. And when I was going through newspaper databases online, I began seeing this name pop up about this missing person from the 1930s. And I began sort of downloading the articles and putting them aside. And when I had some time to look into it more deeply, I discovered this was a case that got quite a lot of media attention back in the 1930s. And it was an unsolved case. It's unsolved today. And there were some very unusual twists and turns in the case that made it kind of unusual. And so I began collecting those materials and creating what we in the biz call a reference file. So it's essentially a box full of articles and different kinds of materials. And so it was really accidental, but it was something that I've been pursuing, along with a few other projects over the past couple of years.
Great. And so, to your understanding, who was Etta?
Etta Riel was a 20-year-old woman. She was a resident. We're going to go back to the year 1934. She was a resident of the town of Oxford, which is 10 or 12 miles south of Worcester. She was a student at what was then called Worcester State Teachers College. This is back before it was a university, when it was really a college just for training teachers. And her parents were Canadian immigrants. They'd settled in Providence. She came from a big family. They moved to Oxford when the kids were young. Her father had died in 27 when she was about 13 years old. So she was living at home with her widowed mother and her siblings and was finishing up her second year at Worcester State. So she would be finishing up her sophomore year. In the spring of 34, right after the semester ended, she filed a paternity suit against a young man named Henry Samhain, who was also someone from Oxford who she'd gone to high school with. She and Henry had a past. They had apparently dated in high school. Some people are quoted as saying that they were fairly serious. People thought maybe they would marry after they graduated. They graduated in 32, and Henry went on to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. Etta remained behind in Oxford. Henry left college in the fall of 33. We don't really know why. It may have been, it was the Great Depression, could have been financial pressures. He returned to Oxford. Etta stated that probably around Christmas of 33 into New Year's of 34, they had reignited their relationship and she became pregnant at the end of January. She would have almost certainly concealed her pregnancy during that spring. Unwed motherhood was very stigmatized in those days. So that was her story. And so she was really facing, I think we could say she was facing a really radical change in her life. She was no longer going to be continuing college. She was going to have to be publicly identified as an unwed mother. And what she sought in this paternity case was for this boy, who she said was the father, to give her child support.
You put it really well when you said that an unwed mother in that time period was something that was stigmatized. Just how important was it for her and her family to maintain that perceived level of respect?
Well, I think that it's an interesting phenomenon. We know that unwed motherhood was very stigmatized. Very few colleges would have permitted an unmarried pregnant woman to continue. And even if she'd been able to continue, very few school boards would have hired her, because school boards were pretty conservative about who they hired. And yet, when you read the media coverage of this case, and that's really where all this information comes from, newspaper clippings, long form journalism, there's a lot of sympathy for her. I think people, in spite of the fact that this was a stigmatized condition, I think that people understood that there was a certain dynamic in life that often put women at the losing end of negotiating sex with a man. This True Detective article, which we might talk about, it's pretty sympathetic toward her. And they even point out that it's the woman who really gets dragged through the mud in these kinds of cases. So it was kind of mixed. Like, she would have been marginalized and stigmatized, but there was a certain compassion and a certain, I think, understanding for the ways in which these things sometimes happen, especially to women who are pretty young and I think maybe a little bit naive.
That article that you referenced, though, correct me if I'm wrong, but that one didn't come out until quite a bit after she had gone missing.
About 2.5 years later, there was a great deal of local media coverage from 34 and 35, and then it sort of tapers off. And then True Detective, which of course is the magazine that the HBO series gets its name from, that famous True Detective magazine, they pick this up again and reignite it in the spring of 37. So there's kind of these ebbs and flows of media coverage, and that was sort of a big uptick. That's when it got a lot of national attention.
Yeah, I was impressed with that, and I'm glad you brought it up, how compassionate they were in this article towards her, even though it was a couple of years later. It was impressive to me that that's the angle that they took. What was, in your opinion, their reasoning for making her such a compassionate figure?
True Detective was known for articles about sort of damsels in distress. So if you look at if you can go online and you can find old True Detective magazine covers, it's always a woman being stalked by a bad man in a sort of fedora, in a silhouette. So there was a lot of that sort of, men rescuing women from bad situations. But I think that these journalists were people who seemed really in touch with law enforcement. And I think they understood that, as we understand today, that women are often victims of violent crimes, and they're often victimized by the men in their lives. And so I think that's something that they were aware of. And, this was not a politically progressive magazine. These were hard-boiled crime reporters. But I think they understood something about the dynamics of society that kind of put women at a disadvantage in a lot of cases, especially in criminal affairs involving men.
Can you tell us about the circumstances of Eda's disappearance?
Yes. So she accuses Henry Samhain. He gets arrested because in those days, if you got a woman pregnant you weren't married to, it was a morals offense. So he gets arrested. He denies everything. He said, we may have dated in high school. We've been friends ever since then. He said he never went to bed with her. He had a girlfriend at the time that he was getting kind of serious with, and he said he was going to defend himself. He said that Eda had other men in her life, and he was going to prove that it was probably one of these other guys who was the father of the baby, implying, I think, that she was trying to trap him in marriage. So the paternity case was rescheduled a couple of times. It was finally scheduled for November 22nd, 6 months in the future. So in that period of time, Eda ends up, she's living at home with her parents. She has her baby at the end of September, little girl she names Alma. She is described as a devoted, attentive mother. She seems to have a good relationship with her family. She has some social support networks in her life. But as the days grow closer, she begins expressing apprehension about this paternity case. She apparently writes some letters to friends saying that she's very anxious, couple of people come forward after the fact saying she kind of wanted to, or she alluded to maybe wanting to run away. One person said she alluded to wanting to commit suicide to avoid this. These paternity cases were very sordid. You know, you had two people trying to discredit each other. They were both gonna kind of be dragged through the mud. Okay, so the days get closer. The mystery really begins the evening of November 21st. So this is the day before the scheduled hearing. Etta makes plans to visit her friend Teresa at Teresa's house late that night around 10 p.m. Teresa's going to do Etta's hair so she looks nice for the court date the next day. Unbeknownst to Etta, Teresa is in contact with Henry Sowen. Now, remember, Oxford's a small town. It's a small high school. All these kids knew each other, like they all went to high school together. So Henry wants to talk to Etta. He tells Teresa this. And Teresa invites him to come along. She thinks maybe she could help orchestrate a reconciliation or some kind of negotiation that would spare them from having to go through this awful court case the next day. So Etta's at Teresa's house. Henry shows up. Etta is not happy to see him. She is silent. She's withdrawn. She does not want to have a conversation with this guy. Henry apparently tries to break the ice by suggesting they go for a drive in his car. Etta refuses. So it ends up being Henry, Teresa, and Etta going for a drive together in Henry's car, trying to kind of smooth things out. It's not going so well. So Henry returns to Oxford. He drops Teresa off at her house, and he and Etta proceed alone to Etta's house, a short distance away, and they park in front of Etta's house. This is around 12:30 a.m. This is the wee hours of the 22nd. And we know that they're parked there because a Oxford police officer sees them parked there, sitting there in front of her house. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, something extraordinary happens. Etta enters her house, and she bursts into the bedroom she shares with her sister, Alice. And she says, "Alice, I've got wonderful news. Henry's going to marry me. He agreed to marry me. We're going to go to New York tonight and get married." Now, it sounds like she thought that Henry had a job lined up in New York. Maybe they had a place to stay. But Etta was elated. Her problems were solved. Everything was going to be great. Alice, her sister, sees her pack a little zipper bag, like an overnight bag with some clothing, some toiletries. She brings a robe with her for the drive to New York. This drive's going to take about 6 hours. It's no interstate highways back then. So it's going to be a long drive at night. She wants to bring this robe to keep her legs warm for the drive. So she hurries, packs this bag, kisses the baby goodbye, says to her sister, "I'll be back to get the baby on Saturday." This is Thursday morning. Before she leaves, she goes to the kitchen and grabs $2 out of the family money jar. This is a petty cash jar the family keeps. She leaves the house with $2 and some change, kisses Alice goodbye, gets into Henry's car and drives off. And that is the last confirmed sighting of Eda Riel in 90 years, was that night. The next day, Alice is walking down the street in Oxford on Main Street, and she sees Henry parked alone in his car. This is late afternoon on the 22nd, the day the hearing was supposed to take place. She goes over and confronts him and says, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in New York marrying my sister. Where's my sister?" And Henry says to Alice, "I don't know what you're talking about. Your sister confessed to me last night that she made the entire thing up. And she asked me to drive her to Worcester, to Union Station, the train station, so she could catch a train out of town. I don't know where she was going." Alice notices that Henry is in the process, sitting in his car, is in the process of writing a note on the back of a grocery bag to Teresa, that mutual friend of theirs. Teresa lives across the street. And the note says, "Dear Teresa, did you know Etta was planning to leave town last night? Question mark." So Alice is flabbergasted. First, there's this dramatic change. They're going to get married. And then she finds out that Etta left town. They cannot figure out where she would have gone, who she would have known. She didn't seem to know people. And for people who don't know, Worcester's not that close to New York. Like, we're many, many hours away by car, several hours away by car. So there was this one person in New York that Etta knew, a woman named Mrs. Holden. She was a school teacher, someone that had taught at Oxford High School. And she had apparently been someone that Etta confided in the early period of her pregnancy, who gave her some advice. The family contacts Mrs. Holden in New York. She knows nothing about Etta coming down to New York to see her. And as days go by, and it's a little unclear how long it was, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, the family finally calls the police and reports her missing because they can't figure out where she would be. And obviously she never came back with a baby, never sent a telegram or a card. So it's really after a period of time, after the 22nd, that the police investigation begins.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Just a couple of questions. Henry and Teresa, is there any indication that these two had an affair?
No, there isn't. I thought about that. I thought, Teresa's sort of the third party in this. She gave a very heartfelt interview several years later, talking about sort of the ordeal of her missing friend and her not involvement, but her presence the night she disappeared, and how she really missed her friend and wanted Etta to come back. It seems like within about 2 years, Henry was married to someone else. Teresa was married to someone else. There really doesn't seem to be any indication that there was anything untoward happening, other than these three kids went to high school together, and Teresa really thought she was helping to orchestrate some kind of positive conversation that night.
But she got herself into a pretty awkward situation in that car ride, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, you can sort of imagine that this was not comfortable, but these are 20-year-olds. They're 20-year-olds from a small town. I can kind of picture the scene that night and how uncomfortable it was. He wanted to talk, Etta didn't. Teresa was trying to be a referee of some sort. I think that was the dynamic that night, or at least according to Teresa, I think that's what she perceived it to be. So.
Wow. So yeah, you mentioned a drastic change and shift. So Etta was not thrilled to see Henry, went on an awkward car ride, dropped Teresa off, and then she's gone forever. And so it's Henry's word, basically, that, he's telling the truth and he actually dropped her off at a train station somewhere, or maybe he did something to her or something, right?
Yeah, and that seems what the police thought initially. When the police began the investigation, he was the person they interviewed. They apparently interrogated him several times. Now, he had an attorney because of this paternity case, but he never changed his story. He told the police the same thing. The police interviewed his family. They interviewed the Riel family, other people in Oxford, their mutual friends. Nothing really seemed to shake loose about this. But obviously he was the one person who might have had motive, means, and opportunity. And obviously he became a sort of person of interest. But they didn't really find evidence against him. And as they began investigating the case, there were these three clues that came up, two of which were very mysterious, that kind of threw a question into what might have happened that night. One of the first clues the police discovered was a mysterious telegram. December the 2nd, Etta's attorney received a telegram ostensibly from her from New York City, instructing him to drop the case. And one of the lines of the telegram was, "Henry is right." Her attorney, it seems, did not really believe this telegram was from her. He was very dubious about it. The police investigated this telegram and discovered that it had been telephoned in from New York City. Now, in those days, when you telephoned in a telegram, you would call the telegram office, you'd give them the name of the person you wanted to reach, plus their address, plus the message, and then your name and your return address. The police discovered that whoever called this in from the payphone gave a false return address. So they went to the return address. It's a vacant lot of demolished buildings. So right there's this kind of mystery. Who called in the telegram? Was it Etta? Was it somebody else? Was it somebody trying to create an alibi? Henry denies any knowledge of the telegram. I would assume, and I don't know this, but I would assume the police looked into his alibi. You couldn't just get to New York in a couple of hours in those days. So he would have been missing for a period of time, you would assume. But it does seem like he had some acquaintances in New York. So I think the police kind of put a pin in that. Weren't sure what to do with it. They put it aside. And that was the first clue.
One quick question on that. Is there a way to tell if the person who called it in was a male or a female?
That's a very good question. I wonder the same thing. Let's think about this. So you're working at the telegram office, phone rings. You hear a voice like mine say, "Hi, I'd like to send a telegram to Worcester. My name is Etta." Well, what are you going to think about that? I think that my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert in how telegrams were sent, so this could be incorrect, but my belief is that what would have happened is that they would take your return address and then send you a bill for the telegram in the mail, 15 cents or whatever. So they would want to make sure that they were going to be sending that bill to a real address and that somebody wasn't clowning, right? So I would imagine that if it wasn't a woman calling, then it would seem really suspicious, right? But that's not covered in any of these stories. But that is an interesting question. I don't think we don't have a firm answer to that, not in any of the resources that I've seen. But I think it might have been a woman that called.
Wow. I think that's the one thing that I would want to hop in a time machine and go back. Like, that's probably my first checkbox to take care of.
One of these articles gives the address of where the payphone was. True Detective magazine said it was a cigar shop. Well, I don't know that women hung out in cigar shops making phone calls in those days. That sounds like a masculine space to me. But, if it's raining or whatever, maybe she was living in a room above it. Who knows? That whole block of Lexington Avenue in New York is now completely rebuilt. So the buildings are long gone, but you can kind of you can sort of go in, not quite a time machine, but you can look at that address today and see what it looks like as opposed to what it was 90 years ago.
First thing that strikes me about that telegram is Henry was right. I don't know if it wasn't something to do with Henry. It seems like a stretch to just compliment him in the first line of it.
It seems like a little on the nose. And I think that's the impression that some people got. Eda's attorney, based on his last name, I think he might have been an in-law or a relative of the Riels. And so I think he tended to side with the Riel family, which tended to think that Eda had not run away. And so that may be why he was particularly dubious of it. But he certainly didn't think it was from her. And he obviously would have known her and her motives. Remember, this woman blew her life up to take a guy to court. The idea that she's just going to skip town at the last minute, I think, seemed a little implausible to him. So that was part of what I was thinking his thinking might have been.
Right. Also occurred to me, like, how busy was Union Station in Worcester at like 1 a.m.?
That's a great story. Okay, so there are two things that happen at Union Station that are particularly interesting. So the police then decide to investigate the runaway possibility. So they go to Union Station and they talk to the train dispatcher who was on duty that night. This is the person who kind of manages the trains coming and going. That person was a woman named Effie Warden. Okay, so they talked to Effie Warden. She said, something really strange happened that night, that early hours of the 22nd. She got 3 phone calls to her unlisted phone number at her office at Union Station. Okay, first phone call comes in at around 2:15 a.m. This is about an hour after Eda would have been last seen getting into Henry's car down in Oxford. And the person calling is a man, doesn't identify himself, but he says he needs to speak to the young woman on the train platform waiting for the train. It's urgent. So she sends a railroad employee out to check the platform. There's nobody there. The guy hangs up. About 5 minutes later, the phone rings again. This time it's a woman. And the woman identifies herself as the phone switchboard operator for the town of Oxford. And she said she has a party on the line who needs to speak to the girl on the platform waiting for the train. Please go get her and put her on the phone. A second search is made of the platform. There's nobody there. Woman hangs up. Phone rings 5 minutes later. It's a woman saying, "Have you found her yet?" And Effie Warden, the dispatcher, explains that there are no more trains departing Worcester that night. So there really shouldn't be anybody on the platform waiting for a train. They never are able to find out who these callers are. They talk to Samhain. He knows nothing about the phone call. And here was the thing. The police found out that the switchboard operator on duty that night in Oxford was not a woman. It was a man. And that man said he never connected any phone calls between Oxford and Worcester that night. So who got the unlisted number? And unlisted just means it's not in any phone book. Nobody could have looked it up. Who got the unlisted phone number? Who is this person saying she was the Oxford phone switchboard operator? Who was the guy? And who else would have known Etta would be at the train station that night? It seems like only Henry would have known, right? Etta tells Henry, he drops her off. Again, here's this clue. It's a dead end. They cannot find who placed these phone calls.
I got to jump in here just to emphasize the significance of the plot twist that you just gave us. It's wild because you are explaining this and everyone's head is going towards Henry doing this to really solidify his alibi. Listen, I knew she was getting on the train. I needed to talk to her, so I called. I had the dispatch call, the operator call, but then he denies doing it. So that just is a huge twist.
Yeah.
And it leaves that question that you're asking, like, who would do this? And the only other people would be her family, right?
Right. And the family didn't know anything about it. Yeah.
And her family didn't know anything about it. That is a wild, wild story.
Yeah. And of course, the question is, if Henry's denying it, it doesn't really alibi him either, because all it proves is that she wasn't there. Right.
Right.
It isn't necessarily helping, but you could say, well, this would throw some fog into the air. Maybe it would create some confusion. Maybe it would create a red herring. Right. So again, there's this question mark. And then the third thing that happens, which I think is very significant, and I don't think it gets as much attention in this case as I think it should. And that is this. The Massachusetts State Police, by this time, this is early months of 1935, January, February. The Massachusetts State Police have multiple detectives working on this. They track down the conductor on the last train out of Worcester that night. So there was a train called the State of Maine that originated in Portland, Maine, and it ended in New York City. And it was a night train. So it left Portland, 9:30 at night. It would arrive in New York City around 6 a.m. And halfway between, it would stop at Worcester at about 1:30 to 2 a.m. The train would have been scheduled to depart at about 5 minutes after 2, which would have been enough time for Etta to get to the station. Okay. They talked to the conductor and he said, yes, I sold a ticket that night to a young woman who boarded the train at Worcester. And he actually had in his pocket that receipt book, right? So if you buy a ticket on it, if you used to buy a ticket on a train, you tell the conductor where you want to go, give the money, he writes the receipt, tears it off, hands it to you. He keeps a copy of the receipt as a record of the transaction. He was able to go back to his receipt book and find this fare that boarded before 2 a.m. on November 22nd. He said it was a young woman who paid with a $5 bill and 2 ones. Well, what did Alice see Etta take from the family money jar that night? Two $1 bills. And he couldn't remember what she looked like. He could not confirm it was her, but he said he remembered that fare because in about 3 months' time, only 2 people boarded that train at Worcester Station in 3 months. And one of them was this unknown woman. So there was virtually nobody at Worcester Station that night. And yet there is this young woman he can't identify. And it's so typical of this case. It seems like we're so close, but this conductor cannot identify her for sure. He just knows that she boarded the train and paid with $7, which, by the way, was over $100 in today's money. So it wasn't small change.
Right. Did Etta have a 5 to go with those two ones?
No one can figure that out. They said, Alice said she left the house with $2 and some change, but one of these articles said that she helped manage the family finances. Remember, her father was deceased, so she was a smart kid. She's going to college, so she apparently helped with paying bills or balancing the checkbook, implying that she maybe could have siphoned money off for herself, potentially, and saved up. But all of these clues have one central problem, which is Etta and Henry didn't know they were going to see each other that night until a couple hours before. So, how do we square this as a forced disappearance? How do we square this as a planned runaway? If Etta didn't see Henry that night, how was she going to get to the train station if she had some plan to go? So again, the police have this really tantalizing clue. And here's an interesting little side note related to archives. The conductor of the train that night was named in the article. His name was Oscar Patch. I looked up Oscar Patch because I'm like, how many of these clues can we verify today, 90 years later? Well, I found on Ancestry.com Oscar Patch's draft card from World War I. And his profession was conductor on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which was the same railroad that ran through the station that night. So this guy was real, his story was real, and the story was given to the newspaper by a state police lieutenant. So I think we can be very confident that the conductor's statement was accurate. We just can't say that it was Etta. If you sit down and try to and I've tried to sort of map out in my head how either one of these scenarios might have happened as a plan, it's really hard to square either, like I said, forced disappearance or runaway as being planned in advance for so many reasons. And yet you can't look at this evidence and say, well, the phone calls didn't happen or this didn't happen. I think it all happened. It just doesn't make sense. So the police were understandably floored by this. They thought, all through the investigation, they seem really confident. We're almost there. We're going to figure it out. And as soon as they find additional information, it's a brick wall. So they're really stuck with, we have evidence, we have circumstantial evidence against this Henry Samhain person, but then we have these really tantalizing clues that maybe she left town, maybe he was telling the truth, and they're really not sure where to go from there.
What were the repercussions, if any, for not attending the trial the next day?
That is a question I really don't know the answer to. I'm thinking about, if you look at civil law today, if people don't show up to court, if they're ignoring a summons, there could be an arrest for the person. But it sounds like whatever the consequences were, they weren't important enough to mention in any of these articles because nobody really goes into discussing what would have happened to either one. Obviously, it seems like Samhain wouldn't have gotten in trouble because Etta didn't show up. So, it's likely the case might have been postponed or dismissed.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because if the person who's doing the suing doesn't show up, then that's a great thing for the person being sued.
Right.
Yeah. Wild.
Was there evidence of other men in Etta's life?
That's a tough question to answer. Throughout these articles, there are references to men that Etta knew, but they don't really get into details of how she knew those men. So as this case gets more and more publicity in the early months of 35, all these witnesses start coming forward claiming to have seen her. And a number of those witnesses, the police seem to take very seriously. So there was a man, described as a man Etta knew, who claimed to have talked with her in downtown Worcester in December. There was another guy that she supposedly knew who claimed that she knocked on his door asking for money. The police ended up dismissing all of these. They didn't say exactly why, but it seemed like maybe it was mistaken identity or maybe these guys were putting him on. There was a guy from Putnam, Connecticut, a few miles south of the state line, who apparently had corresponded with Etta in November. He had gone off to Florida. The police said, aha, that's a secret boyfriend. They ran off to Florida together. When he gets back from Florida, he says, yeah, we knew each other, but I don't know where she is. I never traveled with her. So there were all these men that she knew, but I think we have to be cautious when we consider the fact, all these sort of letters that she was writing. I mean, this was an era when, people had telephones, but Phone service was spotty. It was expensive. We were still in a letter writing culture. And so writing a letter to somebody then might have been like DMing somebody today. It wouldn't necessarily imply a special friendship. Eda's family and inner circle clearly did not think she had other boyfriends. The True Detective magazine said the townspeople in Oxford didn't think she had other boyfriends. She was described as kind of a shy sort of homebody. But, Henry and some of his supporters said she did. And True Detective says, we have evidence she had at least one other boyfriend. But they don't say what the evidence is. And they don't say the guy's name. So that's sort of left hanging in the air. So the answer is she might have, but there's no good evidence that she did.
Is there any chance in your consideration that Henry told her that night, listen, I'll marry you. We'll go to New York. Here's $5. Get on the train tonight. I'll join you in a couple of days. I just got to settle some things here. And he actually just sent her to New York so she would miss the trial?
I suppose it's possible, but then what happened to her?
Right. She would have to have been like, real, I love New York. I'm staying.
There would have been a telegram sent to the family. Henry ghosted me, left me in New York. There's a lot of possibilities, but I think that her permanent silence after that night, I think there's some evidence there. She's described as being, somebody who's very devoted to her kid. She's not an outgoing. I mean, she's social, but she's not adventurous. She doesn't seem like the type who's going to just run off with some guy and start a new life. Seems really unlike her. Now, obviously, people act against types sometimes, but yeah, I think that I can't quite figure out how either one of them could have pre-planned this disappearance with much time to be able to do it.
Right. So she comes back into the house all excited. Either she's lying and knows she's going to probably go missing, or she believed Henry and then something happened to her.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And of course, she seemed to have a good relationship with her sister. Why would she lie to her sister? You might say, well, she came up with this cover story so she could get away without anyone trying to stop her. But again, there's that question of, well, if she pre-planned this, who was going to drive her to the station that night? There's no evidence that she had access to a car.
Doesn't make any sense to pre-plan it the night before court.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big question. And so the police are, as I think, asking a lot of the same questions we're asking today. They hold little conferences at the Grafton police barracks, trying to share information. Nothing's shaking loose. They do a massive ground search in April after the snow melts. They search ponds all across central Worcester, southern Worcester County. They search along all the roads between Oxford and Worcester. They get forestry workers from the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is one of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. They were doing forestry work in East Douglas. They get these guys to search the forest, and there's pictures of these guys doing a grid search, 10 guys in a row walking through pacing through the forest trying to find clues. Nothing turns up. They get groups of Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts from Oxford and Auburn and Millbury spend the weekend searching Purgatory Chasm, this gorge several miles south of Worcester that's very rocky, has a lot of caves and things in it. Nothing turns up. It's described as the biggest ground search in Massachusetts history up to that point, and not one shred of evidence turns up of her being anywhere around Worcester.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
What about the use of a psychic?
I didn't see a lot about that. There are, it's possible psychics might have come forward. It seems like there were a lot of cranks that got attracted to this case, which I think happens with some of these widely publicized mysterious cases. People claiming to see someone. There was a woman in Weymouth who claimed she was hanging out with Etta, and she turned out to be kind of a crank. So they may have consulted psychics on the side. I don't really know whether police were any more or less willing back then to talk to a self-proclaimed psychic as they are today.
Okay, so where are we at currently with Eda's disappearance? Are there any living descendants who are still working on this? Also, What happened with Alma?
The case, of course, grows cold. It gets uptick of publicity in the late 30s. That dies down again. Henry Sowen goes on to marry this young woman, Evelyn, they knew in high school. He lives an exemplary life in Worcester. He is a personnel manager for one of the industrial outfits here in Worcester, ends up being the vice president of the company. He's a joiner. He belongs to all these patriotic organizations. He's a Mason. He gives speeches to businessmen's luncheons. He has a wife and children. They belong to a prominent church. They're involved in church work. It seems like whatever reputational damage he experienced back then did not stick. And, he lived publicly, as far as we know, this very blameless and I would say exemplary middle-class life. Alma ends up being raised by one of Eda's sisters. And she spends part of her childhood in the Framingham area. So she's a little bit removed from Worcester, Oxford area. She knows nothing about her childhood until much later in life. When she's in her 40s and 50s, her aunt tells her everything. She finds out her mother's missing, and she finds out there's this guy, Henry, who is her presumed father. In 1990, Alma, who's in her 50s, files her own paternity suit against Henry Sowen, asking the courts to name him as her biological father. And this reignites both a police investigation. So the Oxford police begin trying to find original police files. Spoiler alert, they're gone. They were lost or discarded. So the original files are gone. But it also ignites a lot of media interest. The news wires get a hold of it. So there's stories across the country about this amazing case. But she has a problem with her case in that the paternity laws are really about establishing financial responsibility for a minor child. So the court throws out the case. She appeals, the appeals court throws it out. But in one of the articles published after the last appeal, this would have been 92, 93, her lawyer says something very interesting, which is there had been a court-ordered blood test recently. And her lawyer states that indicated that Sowen was likely her biological father. Now, Sowen's attorney pipes in response to that and says there were no experts who reviewed that blood test. So it would be irresponsible to make any decisions about what it meant. But it seems like there was a blood test ordered as part of this. But after the last appeal, there was nowhere left to go with the case. And, Sowen dies of natural causes in his 80s. In the late 90s, Alma passes on in her 70s, in the sort of early 2000s. And the case really kind of disappears from there. There really are no living witnesses. Most of the children of the living witnesses are elderly or have passed on. There are descendants for sure. Alma had children, Sowen had children, there are grandchildren. On a message board on Reddit, I was commenting about this page a couple of years ago, and one of the descendants commented and said, this is my family. I had no idea about all of this. So there were still people in the area who were connected, but there doesn't really seem to be any kind of activity. I mean, this is 90 years ago. It's become almost ancient history to people today, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like the searches were pretty thorough, including even exhuming some graves. Is that what I got?
Yeah, that was one piece that I didn't mention. After Eda disappeared, there had been rumors that a grave in the town cemetery in Oxford contained an extra body. Henry Sowen's father was a cemetery sexton, so he did custodial work for the cemetery and dug graves. And a man was buried about 2 days after Eda disappeared. And some people had suggested that grave was dug extra deep, and Eda might have been placed below the coffin. And the police kind of hemmed and hawed and dragged their feet about this. So about 2.5 years later, they actually exhumed the grave. And it was a very, I think, macabre chapter to this, because the press shows up, starts taking pictures. They open up this grave. They take out the coffin of this guy who died 2 years before. They pull out the vault. They start probing. the grave with these rods to try to find any kind of obstacles. They found nothing. It was an ordinary grave. And Samhain's father stood there and watched the whole thing, witnessed the entire exhumation. So that was really kind of the last big dramatic event of this before the 1990s case was revived. And again, dead end.
Did they open the coffin that was in the grave?
I don't believe they opened the coffin, but I think that the case that they made was that the funeral director handled the casket. Someone else handled the digging of the grave. So I think they pretty much left him rest in peace in his box, and they were just sort of searching all around. But yeah, the searches really were exhaustive. And obviously, there's still a lot of woods around here today. There's a lot of rural areas around Worcester. Back then, it was even more so. I don't think they had cadaver dogs in those days. There's no reference to them. I don't know much about the history of cadaver dogs, so don't quote me on that. But there was no reference to that. So they had some limitations, but they really did. I mean, the full force of Massachusetts law enforcement was engaged in this case. Never found a scrap of evidence. Never found enough to bring a bill of indictment or an arrest or anything against anybody.
I feel like those rumors of a missing person being thrown into a grave are probably more prevalent than it actually happening. Although I know there are a few cases where things like that have happened. But
I think if Samhain's stepfather hadn't been involved in grave digging, it probably wouldn't have come up. But I think because he was the person who dug the grave, I think people imagined that had Henry done something, that there might have been some kind of collusion there.
Yeah, well, that was the next thing I wanted to mention was that if Henry did do something, it seems like he needed help from someone.
Yeah, and that's the whole problem. Again, he didn't know he was going to see her that night. So we could speculate that someone might fantasize about doing away with a person for months. But with a couple hours notice, you put some kind of plan in place. It involves mysterious phone calls and someone getting on a train and a body disappearing. And this is a 20-year-old kid from a small town. There is no evidence of any kind of criminal background with anybody involved in this case or their families. There's no suggestion of organized crime. There doesn't seem to be anybody involved in this case who would observe a code of silence about a crime. And this guy had the district attorney, 8 police detectives, the state police. These are 1930s cops. There's no evidence that there was any, police brutality here, but they were not warm, fuzzy guys breathing down his neck for years. Even the Attorney General of Massachusetts was aware of this case, and there was nothing against him, nothing. And I think that's important to remember. It's I think that so often in true crime, people talk about, people are very aware that people aren't who they appear to be, that respectable people have secret lives. And that's true sometimes. But there are a lot of people who get caught up because of circumstantial evidence, get their lives ruined, who are innocent. So I think we have to approach this with both of those ideas in mind when we think about Samhain and his role in this.
What an incredible mystery. It's something that is so local to us, and we're so fortunate to have someone like you delivering this mystery to us because you're very articulate about it. You're very passionate about it. I'm curious if there are other stories that you've looked into that you've found yourself on the same level of passion and something that you've dug deep into, like this one?
Not really. I think there are cases that I find, I think historical mysteries are interesting. I think missing persons cases are interesting because you always want to know sort of what happened to somebody. I do find some of the so-called Bennington Triangle disappearances very interesting. These are a cluster of mysterious disappearances in Vermont. And interestingly enough, one of the people involved in that, a woman named Paula Jean Weldon, who disappeared from Bennington College in, I guess, 46. Etta Riel's name is mentioned in articles about Weldon's disappearance back in the 40s as another mysterious disappearance of a New England college woman. So I think that those cases are interesting. I'm not sure I buy the whole triangle thing. You could draw triangles around a lot of places and maybe find weird stuff that happens. But no, I think this case is one that I've put time into. I think because there is that local connection, and she was a Worcester State student, and I do think that there is some historical interest and I think public interest in preserving information about this case, even if we can't necessarily get closer to solving it today.
Is there any chance of getting like some DNA from a descendant that can be matched to some database of unidentified?
That would be a question for descendants, I think. I mean, part of the problem is if you speculate what happened to her, this was 1934, worst years of the Depression. People were living rough all over the country. I would imagine there were bodies showing up in morgues at a higher rate than there would have been 10 years before or 10 years after. So if we want to speculate that she did leave town and then something happened to her, I think those records are so long gone at this point. I can't imagine how you'd find it. The only thing that I could imagine is if we want to imagine that someone ran away and started a new life and had family members, maybe they're out somewhere. But ultimately that would be for descendants to decide whether that's a worthwhile direction to go in or not.
Wow. Yeah, this was really a great conversation, and we appreciate your time and your research and information into Eda's disappearance. This was a really fascinating conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, like I'm stumped. I don't know what.
I really am too.
I feel like like you watch like a detective show or something, and the detective always solves a crime, but there's that one episode where the detective doesn't solve the crime, and you're like, oh, I feel like that's it. Like we've done so many episodes that revolve around these mysteries, and there's always like a percentage of like, okay, it's probably that person. And this has no percentage of any of that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, in message boards, a few message board discussions about this case, people look at it superficially and say, oh, obviously it's the guy, it's the boyfriend. Yeah, it's him for sure. And that's what it seems like. Again, we don't have a person B. We don't have some other person it could be. So that's sort of, I think, reasonably obviously the direction you go in. But when you look at the more granular evidence here, nothing really works. I mean, you can sort of draw a kind of, 1 to 10, 10 most likely, 1 least likely, and place different scenarios on that line. But I can't really think of one that seems like an aha moment. And as I said, I really think that the facts of the case did happen. I don't think that these were jumbled historically. I don't think that they were exaggerated. I think the phone calls happened. I think the conductor said what he said. I think the telegram came in. So I think that we have pretty reliable sources to work with. We just don't have a really satisfying answer.